Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness reveal who we really are. Sometimes a debt becomes a journey that changes everything. When aging cowboy Jonah Pike rode miles to deliver a dead man's wages to his widow, he expected grief and silence. Instead, he found something that shook him to his core. Alma Reyes stood in the dust of her crumbling homestead, surrounded by dozens of starving, abandoned donkeys, animals nobody wanted. She had given everything to save them, and Jonah, a man who'd spent his life riding alone, suddenly faced a question he'd avoided for years. When the work runs out, what does a man have left to live for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun was barely a suggestion on the eastern horizon when Jonah Pike pulled himself from his narrow bunk in the ranch hand's quarters. His joints protested the movement, a symphony of small pains he'd grown accustomed to over 68 years of hard living. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting his body remember how to be upright, and reached for the silver pocket watch on the nightstand beside him. The watch was cool in his palm, its weight familiar and grounding. He clicked it open, more from habit than necessity, and studied the face in the dim light filtering through the single window. 5:30. Same as always. The watch had belonged to his father and his grandfather before that, passed down through generations of pikemen who'd worked cattle and horses across the American West. On the inside of the cover, worn smooth by decades of thumbs, an inscription read, "Time is the only wealth we truly spend." Jonah closed the watch with a soft click and tucked it into his vest pocket, feeling its familiar press against his chest as he stood. The weight of it always reminded him he was still here, still ticking along like the mechanism inside. Even if the springs didn't wind quite as tight as they used to, the bunkhouse was quiet except for the snoring of two younger hands. Boys, really, in their late 20s who'd signed on last spring. Jonah moved through the room like a ghost, years of rising before dawn, having taught him exactly which floorboards creaked and which stayed silent. He pulled on his boots, ran a hand through his silver hair, still thick, thanked the Lord, and stepped out into the cool morning air. 3 Rivers Ranch spread out before him in shades of grey and purple, the land not yet kissed by the sun. He'd worked this place for 37 years, longer than either of those boys in the bunkhouse had been alive. The ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of high desert country in southern New Mexico, bounded by dry hills to the north and the distant smudge of mountains to the south. It wasn't lush land, not by any measure, but it was honest country that rewarded hard work and punished carelessness in equal measure. Jonah walked toward the main barn, his gait slightly uneven from an old injury to his left hip, a gift from a bad-tempered bull back in '03. The air smelled of creosote and dust, that particular perfume of the desert that he'd come to think of as the scent of home. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote offered one last song to the fading night. The barn was Marcus Donnelly's pride, a massive structure of weathered wood and corrugated tin that housed the ranch's working horses and tack. Jonah pushed through the side door and was greeted by the warm smell of hay and horse, underlaid with leather and liniment. He moved to the third stall on the left, where his gelding, Cisco, stood dozing with one hip cocked. "Morning, old son," Jonah murmured, running a hand along the horse's neck. Cisco was a buckskin, 17 years old, with a white blaze down his face and the kind of steady temperament that came from a lifetime of trust between horse and rider. "Got a long ride ahead of us today." He was cinching the saddle when he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Marcus Donnelly. The ranch owner's gait was distinctive, confident, purposeful, the walk of a man who'd built something and knew its worth. Jonah, boss. Marcus came to stand beside the stall, a man in his early 50s with the kind of lean, sun-hardened build that came from working alongside his hands rather than just directing them. His face was weathered but not unkind, framed by dark hair going silver at the temples. "You sure you want to make this ride today?" It's near 30 miles to the Reyes place. Jonah adjusted the stirrup, checking its length with practiced hands. Carlos earned those wages fair and square. Alma's entitled to them. I could send one of the younger hands, or drive it out myself in the truck. No, sir. Jonah turned to face his boss, meeting his eyes directly. Carlos was my friend for 20 years. This is something I need to do myself. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for further words. Carlos Reyes had been the ranch foreman for 15 years before his heart had given out 3 weeks ago, sudden as a thunderclap on a clear day. He'd been shoeing a horse in this very barn when he'd stumbled, pressed a hand to his chest, and collapsed before anyone could reach him. Jonah had held his friend's hand as the light went out of his eyes, had felt the moment Carlos's grip went slack and the weight of his body became just that, weight, no longer animated by the spark that made a man. Take the northern route, Marcus said. The creek bed should still have some water. You'll need it in this heat. Appreciate it. Marcus pulled an envelope from his shirt pocket, worn and slightly bent. Week's wages plus a little extra. Men deserve more, but it's what I can manage right now. Market's been rough. Jonah took the envelope and tucked it carefully into his saddlebag. He knew what was in it without counting, maybe $300, 4 at most. Not much to show for a lifetime of breaking horses and mending fences. But it was honest money, and in Carlos's world, that had mattered more than the amount. Tell Alma, Marcus started, then stopped, searching for words. Tell her if she needs anything at all. She's got a friend here. I'll tell her. The sun was breaking free of the horizon by the time Jonah rode out, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of the inside of a seashell his mother had kept on a shelf when he was a boy. He pointed Cisco north, toward the line of hills that separated Three Rivers Ranch from the smaller homesteads and settlements beyond. The ride gave him time to think, which was both a blessing and a curse. Jonah had always been more comfortable with action than introspection, but age had a way of forcing a man to look inward whether he wanted to or not. The truth was, Carlos's death had shaken him more than he'd let on to anyone. They'd been the same age, give or take a year, had started working at Three Rivers within months of each other, back in the late 80s. Carlos had been the better horseman, no question about it. The man could gentle a wild mustang with nothing more than patience and a soft voice, could read an animal's mood from the set of its ears or the flick of its tail. But Carlos had also been the one with roots, a wife waiting at home, a little adobe house 20 miles north where smoke rose from the chimney on cold mornings. He'd had something to ride home to. Jonah had never managed that. He'd been married once, briefly, in his 30s. Sarah had been a school teacher in Deming, pretty and patient, and for a while he'd thought maybe he could make that kind of life work. But the ranch always called him back. The rhythm of the cattle drives, the simple clarity of fixing a fence line or breaking a horse. That was the language Jonah spoke fluently. The domestic language of marriage, of planning futures and building homes, had always felt foreign in his mouth. Sarah had left after 2 years, not angry, just disappointed. You're already married, Jonah, she'd told him as she packed her things. To a life that doesn't have room for me in it. She'd been right, and he'd known it even as he'd tried to argue otherwise. That had been 30 years ago. He'd dated here and there over the years, nothing serious. And gradually, the idea of companionship had faded like an old photograph left too long in the sun. He'd told himself he was content, that a man didn't need more than honest work and a good horse to make a life worth living. But Carlos's death had poked a hole in that story. Watching Alma at the funeral, her face composed but her hands trembling as they lowered the casket into the hard earth, Jonah had felt something shift inside him. He'd stood among the other ranch hands, hat in hand, and realized with a cold clarity that this would be him someday, maybe soon. And when they lowered Jonah Pike into the ground, who would stand there with trembling hands? Who would grieve the space he left behind? The thought had been haunting him for 3 weeks now, surfacing at odd moments. When he woke in the bunkhouse with the young hands snoring around him, when he sat alone in the mess hall because the other men had families to go home to on their days off, When he checked his pocket watch and calculated how many years he had left if he was lucky, what does a man live for when the riding days are over? The question had lodged itself in his chest like a thorn, working deeper with each passing day. He was 68 years old. His body still worked mostly, but he could feel time's steady erosion in his joints, in the way his vision blurred at the edges, in how a full day's work left him more tired than it used to. How many years did he have left? 5, 10, if he was fortunate. And what would he do with them? The landscape shifted as he rode, the flat scrubland giving way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinon pine. He stopped twice to let Cisco drink from shallow creeks that carved their way through arroyos, and once to eat a cold biscuit and jerky he'd packed that morning. The sun climbed higher, turning the world bright and harsh, and he pulled his hat brim lower against the glare. It was near 3 in the afternoon when he finally spotted the Reyes homestead in the distance. It sat in a small valley between 2 low hills, an adobe structure that looked like it had grown up from the earth itself. Even from a distance, Jonah could see that the place had a neglected look, a sagging fence line, what appeared to be a partially collapsed outbuilding, and something else he couldn't quite make sense of as he drew closer. The something else resolved into shapes, animals, dozens of them, scattered across the yard and the small paddock behind the house. It took his eyes a moment to process what he was seeing, his mind refusing at first to accept it. Donkeys. The place was overrun with donkeys. They were everywhere, standing in the shade of a ramshackle lean-to, clustered around a water trough, lying in the dust with their legs folded beneath them. Some were small, barely larger than dogs. Others were standard-sized, their long ears twitching at flies. A few looked healthy enough, but many were thin, their ribs showing through dull coats, moving with the lethargy of animals that had known hunger too long. Jonah reined Cisco to a halt at the edge of the property, taking it all in. This wasn't what he'd expected. Not at all. A woman emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the sun. Alma Reyes was 53 years old, her dark hair threaded with silver and pulled back in a practical braid. She wore a faded work dress and boots caked with dried mud and something else, manure probably. Her face was lined from years under the desert sun, but her eyes were bright and alert as she studied him. "Jonah Pike," she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. I wondered if someone from the ranch might come. He dismounted slowly, his hip aching from the long ride, and led Cisco forward. "Mrs. Reyes, I brought Carlos's wages." He gestured vaguely at the animals surrounding them. Didn't expect to find quite such a welcoming committee. A smile flickered across her face, tired but genuine. "They're hungry mostly. They hear a horse and think I might be bringing feed." She moved toward him, and he noticed she walked with a slight limp, favoring her right leg. "Please, call me Alma. I think we're past formalities, don't you think?" Jonah nodded, suddenly awkward with the envelope in his hand. It felt too small, too insignificant against the backdrop of what he was seeing here. "I'm sorry for your loss. Carlos was a good man, best foreman 3 Rivers ever had." "Thank you." Alma's voice was steady, but Jonah saw the way her jaw tightened, the small battle for composure. "He loved that ranch. Loved the work." She paused, looking out across the yard full of animals. "Sometimes I think it was easier for him there than it was here." There was something in the way she said it, not bitter, just honest, that made Jonah look at her more closely. This was a woman who'd lived with hard truths for a long time. "Come inside," Alma said. "You've ridden a long way. I'll make coffee." The inside of the adobe house was cool and dim, a welcome relief from the afternoon heat. Jonah removed his hat as Alma led him through a small living room furnished with well-worn pieces that had seen better days. A couch with faded upholstery, a wooden chair with one arm darker than the other where it had been repaired, shelves lined with books, and a few photographs in simple frames. One photo caught his eye, Carlos and Alma on their wedding day, both impossibly young, standing in front of this very house when it still wore fresh paint and hope. Carlos's smile was wide and genuine, his arm around Alma's waist. and she was laughing at something beyond the frame. Her whole face lit with joy. "That was 32 years ago," Alma said quietly, following his gaze. "We were babies, really. Thought we knew everything." She moved into the kitchen, a narrow space with a wood stove and a sink that had a basin underneath to catch water. "We knew nothing." Jonah settled into a chair at the small kitchen table while Alma worked at the stove, building up the fire and setting a battered pot of water to boil. Through the window above the sink he could see several donkeys standing in what had once been a vegetable garden, their heads hanging low in the heat. "I have to ask," Jonah said carefully. "The donkeys?" 47, Alma said without turning around. 47 at last count, though one of the Jennies is due to foal any day now, so that number might change. Jonah blinked. He'd guessed maybe 20, 30 at most. "That's a lot of mouths to feed." "It is." Alma measured coffee grounds into a pot with practiced efficiency. "And before you ask, no, I can't really afford it. I can't afford much of anything anymore." She turned to face him, leaning back against the counter. "But I can't turn them away either. Where did they all come from?" Alma's expression softened, became almost dreamlike. "Everywhere. Nowhere. The first ones showed up about 2 years ago, a pair of them, geldings, wandering down the road like they were looking for something. They were in bad shape. Hooves cracked and overgrown, ribs showing, covered in sores. Someone had just turned them loose, I guess. Didn't want them anymore." She poured boiling water over the grounds, and the smell of coffee filled the small kitchen. "I fed them. Put salve on their sores. Trimmed their hooves as best I could. Carlos showed me how once, years ago. And then word just seemed to spread somehow. More started showing up. People would trailer them here in the middle of the night and let them loose. Traders passing through would ask if I'd take one that had gone lame. Farms that folded would dump their stock and disappear." Alma brought 2 chipped mugs to the table and sat across from him, her hands wrapped around the mug like she was trying to draw warmth from it despite the heat of the day. "I kept thinking someone else would step in. Animal control, the county, someone. But nobody came. And these animals, they're not wild horses that can survive on their own out here. Donkeys are domesticated. They depend on people. So if people don't want them anymore..." She shrugged, a gesture that carried the weight of the world. "Someone has to." Jonah sipped his coffee, thinking. The arithmetic was brutal. 47 animals, even small ones, would eat through hay and grain like locusts. Water alone would be a constant struggle in this country. And the property was barely holding together. He could see that much from the outside. "Carlos's wages," he said, pulling the envelope from his pocket and placing it on the table between them. "It's not much, but it's honest money. He earned every penny." Alma stared at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. When she finally reached for it, her fingers trembled slightly. She opened it, counted the bills quickly, and her eyes closed briefly. $320, she whispered. "Do you know how long this will last?" 2 weeks of feed, maybe 3 if I stretch it. Then we're back where we started. What about selling some of them?" "To who?" Alma's voice sharpened with frustration. "Nobody wants unwanted donkeys. That's how they ended up here in the first place. And I won't send them to slaughter. I won't." She stood abruptly, moved to the window, stared out at the animals in her yard. "Carlos thought I was crazy. We fought about it constantly those last few months. He wanted me to stop, to turn them away, but I couldn't. Every time I'd see one standing at the fence, hungry and scared..." Her voice broke slightly. "How do you choose? How do you decide which one gets to eat and which one doesn't?" Jonah sat in silence, absorbing this. He'd expected to find a grieving widow, to offer his condolences and the envelope of money, to ride back to 3 Rivers with his duty discharged. Instead, he'd stumbled into something he didn't fully understand, a woman waging a war against cruelty and indifference, armed with nothing but stubborn compassion and a checkbook that must be running on fumes. "How long can you keep this up?" he asked gently. Alma turned from the window, and in the afternoon light filtering through, Jonah could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She looked older than 53, worn down by months or maybe years of carrying this burden alone. "I don't know," she admitted. "The feed store in town has been letting me run a tab, but they're getting nervous. I'm 3 months behind on that." The property taxes are due next month, and I don't have the money. Carlos's life insurance was barely enough to cover the funeral. She laughed, a sound without humor. I sold my wedding ring last month. Got $200 for it. It lasted a week and a half. Jonah's chest tightened. He looked down at his coffee, at his weathered hands wrapped around the mug, and felt something shift inside him, a door opening that he'd kept closed for a very long time. I could stay, he heard himself say, just for tonight. Help you with the evening feeding, maybe fix some of that fencing before I head back tomorrow. Alma turned to him, surprise clear on her face. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, but I rode 30 miles to get here, and Cisco could use a rest before we head back. Might as well make myself useful. For a moment, Alma just looked at him, and Jonah saw something in her eyes he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or simply the acknowledgement that she wasn't entirely alone in this impossible fight. At least for one evening, there's a small barn out back where you can stable your horse, she said finally. It's not much, but it's dry, and I'll make us some dinner after the feeding. It won't be fancy. Fancy's never been my style. They finished their coffee in companionable silence, and then Alma stood, squaring her shoulders like a soldier preparing for battle. Come on, then. I'll show you the routine. Fair warning, it's not pretty and it's not easy. Jonah followed her outside into the blazing afternoon sun. As they walked toward the lean-to where feed bags were stacked, several donkeys began to gather, their ears pricked forward with interest. One small Jenny, her coat the color of dust, came right up to Alma and pushed her nose against the woman's palm. Alma stroked the animal's face with infinite gentleness, and Jonah saw tears gather in the corners of her eyes. This is Daisy, she said softly. Someone left her tied to my fence post in the middle of January. It was below freezing that night. She almost died. The little donkey leaned into Alma's touch, making a sound somewhere between a wheeze and a sigh. And Jonah, watching this woman cradle an animal that the world had thrown away, felt something crack open inside his chest, a feeling he couldn't name, but recognized nonetheless as the beginning of understanding. He'd come here to settle a debt. But standing in this dusty yard, surrounded by forgotten creatures and this woman who refused to forget them, Jonah realized he'd stumbled into something far more complicated, something that asked questions he'd been avoiding his whole life. What does a man live for when the riding days are over? Maybe, he thought as he reached out to touch Daisy's soft nose. The answer was standing right in front of him, wearing a faded work dress and caked in manure. Fighting a battle she couldn't possibly win, but refusing to surrender. Maybe the answer wasn't about what a man rode toward, but what he chose to stand for when the riding stopped. The evening feeding was a choreographed chaos that Alma had clearly refined through repetition. She moved through it with the efficiency of long practice, measuring out portions of hay and a grain mix that she stretched as far as it would go, dividing it among battered feed tubs scattered across the property. Jonah followed her lead, hauling 50-pound bags of feed from the lean-to to various stations, while Alma distributed water from a hose connected to a well that coughed and sputtered with age. The donkeys pressed in around them, patient but insistent, their big dark eyes tracking every movement. The Jennies eat first, Alma explained, pointing to a group of females clustered near the barn. Then the geldings, then the foals. The healthier ones can wait a bit longer than the ones still recovering. Recovering from what? Everything. Alma's voice was matter-of-fact as she poured grain into a tub where a small grey jack stood waiting. Starvation, neglect, injury? That one there. She indicated a donkey standing apart from the others, a large standard with a white muzzle, was beaten so badly his shoulder never healed right. He can't work anymore, so his owner dumped him on the highway. Deputy Miller called me, asked if I could take him. I couldn't say no. Jonah studied the animal she'd pointed out. The donkey stood with his weight shifted off his left front leg, and when he moved toward a feed tub, his gait was distinctly uneven. But his eyes were bright and alert, and he ate with the steady purpose of an animal who knew where his next meal was coming from. What's his name? Samson. Seemed fitting, strong despite everything. Alma filled another water trough, her movements practiced and economical. I name them all. People say I shouldn't, that it makes it harder, but they deserve names. They deserve to be seen as individuals, not just problems to be solved. They worked for over an hour in the golden light of late afternoon, and Jonah found himself learning the geography of Alma's small kingdom. The paddock behind the barn, where the nursing jennies stayed with their foals. The shaded area under the cottonwood trees, where the oldest donkeys rested during the heat of the day. The separate pen where a young Jack with behavioral issues was kept isolated until Alma could work with him on his aggression. "That's Sergeant," she said, noticing Jonah's attention on the young Jack. "He's been here 3 months. Someone thought it would be funny to teach him to bite and kick. Now he doesn't trust anyone. Can he be rehabilitated?" "I think so. It takes time." Alma leaned against the fence, watching Sergeant pace along the far side of his pen. "Everything takes time. Time and patience and consistency. The things that hurt them didn't happen overnight, so healing won't either." There was something in the way she said it, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Jonah recognized it because he'd felt it himself over the years, that bone-deep fatigue that came from carrying weight too long without relief. "How long since you had help with this?" he asked. Alma was quiet for a moment. "Carlos used to help when he could, on his days off. But the last 6 months..." She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "He was angry a lot. About the money, about the animals, about me refusing to give up. We barely spoke some weeks. He'd come home, eat dinner in silence, and leave again in the morning." She turned to look at Jonah directly. "I know what you're thinking. That I chose these animals over my husband. I wasn't thinking that. Everyone else did. The neighbors, our friends from church. They all thought I'd lost my mind." Alma's voice was steady, but Jonah heard the hurt underneath. "Maybe I did, but I can't look at a suffering creature and just walk away. Carlos understood that once. It's part of what made me love him. But somewhere along the way, he stopped understanding. Or maybe I stopped making sense." Jonah pulled off his hat and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. The work had been harder than he'd expected, not because of the physical labor, he was used to that, but because of the emotional weight that seemed to hang over everything. Each animal represented a choice, a burden, a small act of defiance against a world that had declared these creatures expendable. "You ever think about what happens if you can't keep going?" he asked. "Every single day." Alma's answer was immediate and raw. "Every time I look at the account balance, every time another one shows up at my gate, every time I have to decide between buying feed and paying the electric bill. But then I look at them." She gestured at the donkeys scattered across the property, some eating, others simply standing in the cooling evening air. "And I think, who will care if I don't? Who will be their voice?" They finished the feeding as the sun began to set, painting the hills in shades of purple and gold. Jonah's shoulders ached and his hip throbbed, but there was something satisfying about the work. A tangible result, animals fed and watered, small needs met, even if the larger problem remained unsolved. Alma showed him the barn, where he could stable Cisco for the night. It was a modest structure, but sturdy, with 2 stalls and a small tack room that smelled of leather and age. Jonah unsaddled his gelding, brushed him down, and gave him grain and fresh water. Cisco ate contentedly, unbothered by the curious donkeys who peered in from the yard. "There's a Jenny in the next stall," Alma said from the doorway. "She's due any day now. I've been checking on her every few hours through the night." Jonah glanced over the divider and saw a small, heavily pregnant donkey lying in deep straw. Her sides were distended, her breathing slow and steady. "First foal?" "Second. She lost the first one last year, born too early, didn't make it." Alma's voice softened with remembered grief. "I'm hoping this time will be different. What's her name?" "Esperanza." "It means hope." Jonah nodded, understanding the weight of that name. Hope was what this whole impossible enterprise ran on. Hope that another bag of feed could be purchased, that another day could be survived, that suffering could be eased, even if just for a moment. As they walked back toward the house, the evening air cooling around them, Jonah found himself thinking about the silver pocket watch in his vest. Time is the only wealth we truly spend. His father had believed that, had lived by it. But watching Alma move through her evening routine, checking water levels one more time, scratching the ears of a donkey who came to the fence for attention, securing gates against the night, Jonah wondered if maybe there were other forms of wealth. Harder to measure, impossible to save, but no less valuable. The wealth of showing up, of staying, of refusing to turn away, even when every practical consideration said you should. Inside the house, Alma lit kerosene lamps against the gathering dark and began preparing dinner. Jonah sat at the kitchen table, his body tired in a way that felt good, earned. Through the window, he could see the shapes of donkeys settling in for the night, their silhouettes stark against the last light of day. "Thank you," Alma said quietly, her back to him as she worked at the stove. "For staying, for helping." "You didn't have to." "No," Jonah agreed. "I didn't have to." But sitting in that warm kitchen, watching this woman who'd given everything for creatures the world had discarded, Jonah realized that somewhere between delivering an envelope of wages and hauling bags of feed, have to had stopped being the relevant question. The question now was different, and far more dangerous. What if he didn't want to leave? Dinner was simple but good. Beans and rice with cornbread, the kind of meal that stretched a budget while filling empty spaces. They ate by lamplight, the warm glow softening the worn edges of the kitchen. Outside, the night settled in with the sound of donkeys shifting in their sleep and the distant yip of coyotes in the hills. "Tell me about Carlos," Jonah said after a while. "Not the foreman, not the horseman. The man you married." Alma set down her fork, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "He was 23 when we met. I was 21. He worked for my father's ranch, just a hand then, ambitious but green." She reached for a cup of water, her fingers tracing the rim absently. "He had this way of talking to horses, so quiet you could barely hear him, but they listened. Really listened. I'd watch him in the corral and think, that's a man who understands that strength isn't always loud. He was a good teacher," Jonah said. "Taught me things about horses I'd never learned in 40 years of working cattle." He loved teaching. Alma's voice carried warmth and sadness in equal measure. "Should have been a father. We tried for years." She stopped, the old grief still sharp enough to cut. "It never happened. The doctors said it was me, something wrong with my body that wouldn't cooperate. Carlos said it didn't matter, that we had each other. But I always wondered if he resented me for it, secretly, in the places he couldn't say out loud." Jonah thought about his own childless life, the nieces and nephews he sent cards to but rarely saw. "Some people aren't meant to have children. Doesn't make them less." "No," Alma agreed. "But it makes you wonder about legacy, doesn't it? What you leave behind when you're gone." She gestured vaguely toward the darkness beyond the window. "Maybe that's why I do this. The donkeys, they're not children, I know that. But they're living things that need care. And when I'm gone, maybe someone will remember that Alma Reyes tried to make a difference, even if it was just for unwanted animals nobody else wanted to save." The honesty of it struck Jonah silent for a moment. He'd spent decades defining himself by the work he did. The horses broken, the cattle moved, the fences mended. But what did any of it amount to? When Jonah Pike was lowered into the ground, what would people say? That he was reliable? That he showed up on time? That he never complained? "I was married once," Jonah heard himself say, surprising himself with the admission. "Long time ago. Didn't take." She wanted a partner, someone who was there, really there. "I couldn't figure out how to be that and still be myself." "Do you regret it?" Jonah considered the question carefully. "I regret hurting her. She was a good woman, deserved better than what I could give. But do I regret not changing who I am to make it work? I don't know. Maybe that makes me selfish. Or honest." Alma stood to clear their plates, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this task thousands of times. "Carlos and I loved each other. I believe that. But toward the end," she paused at the sink, her back to him. "Toward the end, we were just two people living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, talking past each other instead of to each other. The donkeys became a way to avoid dealing with what was really wrong, which was that we'd built different dreams. Alma turned to face him, leaning against the counter. Carlos wanted security, stability, a comfortable retirement, maybe some travel. I wanted, she gestured helplessly, I wanted to matter, to make a difference, even a small one. Every time I saw suffering and had the power to ease it, even slightly, I felt like I was doing something important. But to Carlos, I was just throwing money away on a problem we couldn't solve. He had a point, Jonah said gently. You can't save them all. I know. Alma's voice cracked slightly. Believe me, I know. But does that mean I shouldn't save any? If I can feed one more donkey, give shelter to one more forgotten animal, isn't that worth something? Jonah thought about the young Jenny named Daisy, nearly frozen to death before Alma took her in. He thought about Samson with his injured shoulder, eating peacefully despite a lifetime of cruelty. He thought about Esperanza, heavy with a foal, given another chance at motherhood. It's worth something, he said finally. Question is whether you can sustain it. I can't. The admission came flat and final. The money's gone. In 2 weeks, maybe 3, I won't be able to buy feed. The property taxes come due, and I don't have them. If I don't pay, the county will foreclose. And then what happens to the donkeys? The weight of it hung in the air between them, heavy as smoke. Jonah recognized the look on Alma's face, the expression of someone staring at an impossible situation with clear eyes, knowing that wanting something badly enough didn't make it possible. How much do you need? He asked. Alma shook her head. More than I can ask for, more than anyone has to give. The property taxes alone are $3,000. The feed bill at the store is $1,200. And that's just to get current. It doesn't solve the ongoing problem of feeding 47 animals through the winter. Jonah did the math in his head. His savings account held maybe $11,000, accumulated over decades of modest living and few expenses. It would be enough to get her current, buy some time. But then what? He'd be right back where he started, except broke, and no closer to an actual solution. He opened his mouth to say this, to explain why throwing his savings at her problem would just delay the inevitable. But what came out instead was, what if I stayed? Not just tonight, a week maybe. Help you figure something out. Alma stared at him. Jonah, you have a job, a life. You can't just walk away from that. I've got vacation time saved up. 20 years worth, near enough. Never had a reason to use it before. He surprised himself with how reasonable it sounded, how natural. Marcus won't mind. And maybe between the two of us, we can come up with something. Like what? I don't know yet. Jonah stood, suddenly restless. But sitting at 3 Rivers, knowing you're here, fighting this alone, he stopped, searching for words. I can't do that. Not after seeing what you're trying to do. Alma's eyes glistened in the lamplight. Why? You barely know me. It was a fair question, and Jonah didn't have a good answer. Or rather, he had an answer but wasn't sure he could articulate it. Something about watching her gentle that frightened Jenny. Something about the way she'd said they deserve names. Something about recognizing in her the thing he'd been missing his whole life without knowing it. A purpose that extended beyond the next fence line, the next cattle drive, the next day's work. Carlos was my friend, Jonah said finally. And you're in trouble. That's reason enough. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. The rest, the strange pull he felt toward this place, the sense that he was standing at a crossroads he hadn't known existed, that was harder to name. Alma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that was somehow both vulnerable and fierce. A week, she said. We'll see what we can figure out in a week. But Jonah, don't make promises you can't keep. These animals have already been let down too many times. I won't, he said, and meant it. They cleaned up in companionable silence, and then Alma showed him to a small room off the kitchen that had once been Carlos's office. There was a narrow bed, a desk piled with papers and livestock magazines, and a window that looked out toward the barn. I need to check on Esperanza before I sleep, Alma said from the doorway. You're welcome to come if you'd like. Jonah followed her out into the cool night. The sky was massive with stars, the Milky Way a river of light overhead. In the barn, Esperanza lay in her stall, her breathing steady and deep. Alma knelt beside her, running a gentle hand along the Jenny's neck. "Soon," she whispered to the animal. "Soon you'll have your baby, and everything will be worth it." Watching her there, Jonah felt his pocket watch press against his chest, a reminder of time passing, of choices made and unmade. He'd ridden here to deliver wages and ride away. Instead, he'd agreed to stay, to help, to step into a situation he didn't fully understand for reasons he couldn't quite explain. Time is the only wealth we truly spend. Maybe, Jonah thought as they walked back to the house under that vast sky. It was time he started spending his wealth more carefully. Morning came early, announced by the braying of donkeys who knew the routine better than any clock. Jonah woke disoriented for a moment, the unfamiliar room taking time to place. Then memory caught up. The ride, the donkeys, his promise to stay. He found Alma already in the kitchen, coffee brewing, her hair still damp from washing. She looked up as he entered, offering a tired smile that suggested she hadn't slept much. "Esperanza?" he asked. "Still waiting. Could be today, could be another week. Donkeys keep their own schedule." She poured him coffee in the same chipped mug from yesterday. "There's eggs if you want them. Chickens are the only creatures here that pay their way." They ate breakfast in companionable silence, then headed out to start the morning feeding. The work was already becoming familiar to Jonah. The sequence of it, the personalities of individual animals who had preferences for where they ate and who they stood near. He noticed things he'd missed yesterday, the way Alma always checked hooves and eyes as she moved through the herd, looking for problems before they became crises. The hierarchy among the donkeys, subtle but definite. The one old Jack who always ate last, waiting patiently until everyone else had finished. "That's Moses," Alma said, catching his gaze. "He was my first. The one who started all this." She moved to fill his feed tub, and the old donkey approached slowly, his grey muzzle nearly white with age. "Someone left him tied to a fence post 10 miles from here. Deputy found him 3 days later, half dead from dehydration. Called me because he knew I had land. I think he hoped I just put the poor creature down. Instead," she stroked Moses's neck with deep affection. "Instead, I fell in love." Jonah watched the old donkey eat, noting the deliberate way he chewed, the care with which Alma had positioned his tub in the shade. "How old is he?" 32, near as the vet could guess. "That's old for a donkey. He's earned his retirement, haven't you, old man?" After the morning feeding, Jonah walked back to the house and used Alma's phone to call 3 Rivers. Marcus answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Pike was wondering when you'd check in." "I'm still at the Reyes place," Jonah said, feeling awkward in a way he couldn't quite name. "I was hoping to take some of that vacation time I've got saved up. Stay here a week or so." Silence on the other end of the line, long enough that Jonah thought the connection might have dropped. "Then everything all right?" "Yes, sir. Just Mrs. Reyes could use some help around the place. Seemed wrong to ride off and leave her to it." More silence. Then Marcus's voice came back, careful and measured. "You've got the time coming to you, Jonah. Take what you need. But are you sure about this? You barely know the woman. I knew Carlos." "That counts for something." "It does," Marcus agreed. "Just be careful, all right? I've seen men your age make decisions that feel right in the moment, but look different in the cold light of morning." "I'm not making any decisions," Jonah said, though even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. "Just helping a friend's widow for a few days. All right, keep me posted. And Jonah, if you need anything, I know." "Thank you." He hung up, feeling unsettled. Marcus wasn't wrong to be concerned. Jonah was acting out of character, making choices that didn't fit the pattern of his carefully ordered life. But standing in Alma's kitchen, looking out at the yard full of animals who'd been thrown away and saved, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that the pattern needed breaking. The rest of the morning was spent on repairs. The fence line was a disaster, posts rotted through, wire sagging or missing entirely. Jonah found tools in a shed behind the house, a collection of rusty implements that had seen better days but would serve. Alma worked beside him, holding posts steady while he drove them in, passing wire cutters and pliers before he asked for them. They developed a rhythm, wordless and efficient, and Jonah found himself appreciating the way she worked. No wasted motion, no complaints about the heat or the difficulty. Just steady, focused effort toward a problem that wouldn't be solved in a day, but might be improved. "Carlos and I built this fence together," Alma said at one point, wiping sweat from her forehead. "First year we were married. Thought we'd have livestock eventually, horses maybe. Instead," she gestured at the donkeys, watching them work, "we got something different. Not what you planned. Nothing ever is." Alma hammered a staple into place with 3 efficient strikes. "We planned children, a comfortable life, growing old together, traveling to places we'd only seen in magazines. Instead, I got a husband who worked himself to death and 47 animals nobody wanted. But you know what? I wouldn't trade Moses for anything, or Daisy or Samson or any of them. They chose me as much as I chose them." Jonah thought about his own life, the plans that had never materialized, the futures that had remained hypothetical. "We spend a lot of time mourning what we didn't get," he said. "Maybe not enough appreciating what we did." Spoken like a man who's done his share of mourning. "Some," Jonah admitted. "More than I'd like to think about." They worked through the heat of the day, stopping only for water and a quick lunch of sandwiches eaten in the shade of the cottonwood tree. The donkeys clustered around them, hopeful for treats, and Alma produced apple slices from her pocket, distributing them with the solemnity of a communion ritual. "They remember kindness," she said, watching a young Jenny take an apple slice with delicate lips. "That's what people don't understand. These animals remember every person who hurt them, but they also remember every person who showed them gentleness. And they choose to trust again, despite everything. That takes more courage than most people ever have to show." By late afternoon, they'd replaced 12 fence posts and run new wire along a 100-foot stretch. It wasn't much against the scope of what needed doing, but it was visible progress. The kind that felt good in tired muscles and aching backs. "You're good at this," Alma said, as they packed away tools. "Been doing it long enough." "That's not what I mean." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "You're good at showing up, at doing the work that needs doing without expecting thanks or recognition. That's rarer than you might think." Jonah didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and carried the toolbox back to the shed. But her words stayed with him as they did the evening feeding, as they ate dinner by lamplight, as they made their final check on Esperanza before bed, showing up. It seemed like such a small thing, barely worth mentioning. But watching Alma move through her routine with the devotion of a monk at prayer, Jonah began to understand that showing up was everything. It was the difference between intention and action, between sympathy and solidarity, between walking away and choosing to stay. That night, lying in the narrow bed in Carlos's old office, Jonah pulled out his pocket watch and opened it in the darkness. He couldn't see the inscription, but he knew it by heart. "Time is the only wealth we truly spend." His father had meant it as a reminder to use time wisely, not to waste it. But lying there in the dark, listening to the sounds of donkeys settling for the night, Jonah wondered if there was another way to read it. Maybe time wasn't meant to be hoarded like money in a bank. Maybe the point was to spend it, to pour it out in service of something bigger than yourself. Even if that something was as simple as feeding hungry animals and mending broken fences, maybe. Jonah thought as sleep finally pulled him under, the wealth wasn't in the keeping, it was in the spending. 3 days into his stay, Jonah found Alma sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, bills, statements, notices printed on official letterhead. Her hair was pulled back severely, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible arithmetic. "How bad is it?" he asked, pouring himself coffee. Alma looked up, and for a moment he saw past the determined facade to the fear underneath. "Worse than I thought. The feed store bill is actually $1,600, not $12. There's a vet bill I'd forgotten about, $800. And the county sent another notice about the property taxes. If I don't pay by the end of next month, they'll start foreclosure proceedings." Jonah sat down across from her, studying the papers spread across the table. Numbers told their own brutal story. Income near zero, expenses mounting, time running out. What about Carlos's pension from the ranch? There isn't one. Ranch hands don't get pensions, Jonah, you know that. Her voice was flat, exhausted. His Social Security would have started next year, but he didn't make it. I'd get a widow's benefit, $600 a month. That covers the property taxes if nothing else goes wrong. But everything goes wrong. What about selling the property? Alma laughed, a sound without humor. Who would buy it? The house is falling apart. The land is marginal at best, and it comes with 47 donkeys that can't be moved. No one wants this problem, Jonah. That's why it's mine. Jonah looked at the woman across from him, proud, exhausted, refusing to surrender even as the walls closed in. He thought about his savings account, the $11,000 that represented a lifetime of modest living. It would be enough to clear the immediate debts, buy some breathing room. But then what? The underlying problem would remain. Too many animals, too little income. No sustainable path forward. There has to be another way, he said. I've been looking for another way for 2 years. Alma gathered the papers into a pile, her movements sharp with frustration. Do you know what people say when I ask for help? That I brought this on myself. That nobody forced me to take in all these animals. That I should just... Her voice cracked. Just get rid of them. As if they're not living beings who feel pain and fear. As if their lives don't matter because they're inconvenient. Jonah reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture surprised them both. He wasn't a man given to physical comfort. But seeing her there, drowning in paper and desperation, something in him couldn't not reach out. Their lives matter, he said quietly. And so does yours. Alma's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Sometimes I think it would have been easier if I'd never started this. If I'd just let that first donkey, Moses, if I'd let him die like everyone expected, then none of this would have happened. But you'd be someone different, someone who could walk past suffering without stopping. Maybe that person would be happier. Maybe, Jonah agreed. But would she be able to look at herself in the mirror? Alma pulled her hand back and wiped her eyes roughly. Principles are expensive, Jonah. I'm learning that the hard way. They spent the rest of the morning working in heavy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The fence repair continued, steady and methodical. Jonah found a kind of meditation in the physical work, the rhythm of the post-hole digger, the satisfaction of wire pulled taut and stapled true. But underneath it all, the numbers from Alma's kitchen table nagged at him. That afternoon, while Alma was checking on Esperanza, Jonah walked to the edge of the property and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called in 5 years. Pike residence. His brother's voice, cautious and surprised. Daniel. It's Jonah. Well, hell. Didn't expect to hear from you. Everything all right? Jonah and his younger brother had never been close. Daniel had gone to college, become an accountant, married, and had 3 kids, built a life in Albuquerque that was as foreign to Jonah as the surface of the moon. They exchanged Christmas cards and little else. I need some advice, Jonah said. Financial advice. There's a woman... Oh boy. Daniel's voice shifted, taking on a tone Jonah recognized from childhood, the responsible younger brother preparing to clean up the irresponsible older brother's mess. Please tell me you didn't invest in something stupid. Nothing like that. Just there's a situation. A lot of animals that need care, not enough money to provide it. I'm trying to help figure out if there's a legal way forward. Non-profit status, donation, something. How many animals? 47 donkeys. Silence. Then, did you say donkeys? Yes. 47 of them? Give or take. Daniel whistled low. Jonah, setting up a legitimate animal sanctuary, requires permits, insurance, a board of directors, 501c3 status. We're talking months of paperwork and legal fees that probably run 5 figures. Is this woman a family member? A girlfriend? She's the widow of a friend, and you're doing this out of the goodness of your heart. Jonah bristled at the skepticism in his brother's voice. Carlos was a good man. His wife needs help. There are agencies for this. Animal control, wildlife services. Why isn't she going through proper channels? Because proper channels would take the animals away and put them down. They're not wild, Daniel. They're domesticated animals that people abandoned. Someone has to care for them. That someone doesn't have to be you. Daniel's voice softened slightly. Look, I'm not trying to be harsh, but you're 68 years old, with probably 80,000 in savings if I had to guess. You walk into this situation, try to fix it with your checkbook, you'll burn through your retirement in 6 months and still not solve the problem. These situations don't have heroes, Jonah. They just have victims. So your advice is to walk away. My advice is to be realistic about what you can and can't fix. You want to help? Write her a check for $1,000 and move on with your life. Jonah thanked his brother and ended the call, feeling more unsettled than before. Daniel wasn't wrong about the mathematics. The problem was too big, too expensive, too complex for one man or even two to solve with willpower and good intentions. But walking away, that was something Jonah found he couldn't do anymore. That evening, after dinner, he found Alma in the barn sitting beside Esperanza's stall. The pregnant Jenny was restless, pacing the small space, her breathing labored. "Tonight," Alma said quietly. "I think it's going to be tonight." Jonah settled beside her on a bale of hay, and they waited together in the warm darkness. Outside, the other donkeys had settled for the night, their occasional braying punctuating the silence. "I called my brother," Jonah said after a while. "Asked him about setting up a proper sanctuary. Legal status, donations, the works. And he said it's complicated, expensive, probably impossible in our timeline." Alma nodded, unsurprised. "I've looked into it. You need money to save money, it turns out. The permits alone cost more than I have." They sat in companionable silence, watching Esperanza pace. The Jenny's sides heaved with the weight she carried, and every few minutes she'd stop and look back at her flank, confused by the sensation of something moving inside her. "I can't save them all," Alma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that. I've always known it. But if I can save some, if I can give some of them a chance, isn't that better than saving none?" "It is," Jonah said, and meant it. Esperanza went down then, a groan escaping her as she folded to the straw. Alma was on her feet immediately, moving to the Jenny's side, her hands gentle and sure. "Here we go," she murmured. "Time to meet your baby, sweet girl." Jonah watched as Alma worked, coaching the Jenny through the contractions, checking the position of the foal, her voice a steady stream of encouragement and comfort. And in that moment, watching this woman fight for new life while everything around her crumbled, Jonah understood something fundamental. This wasn't about saving animals. It was about refusing to accept that suffering was inevitable, that cruelty was acceptable, that some lives simply didn't matter. The foal came at midnight, sliding into the world in a rush of fluid and membrane. A Jenny, small and perfect, with her mother's colouring and impossibly long legs. Alma cleared the foal's airways with practiced hands, stimulated breathing, moved her to where Esperanza could nuzzle and clean her baby. "Welcome to the world," Alma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome to the world, little one." Jonah felt something break open in his chest. A wall he'd built so carefully over decades, brick by brick, protecting himself from exactly this kind of feeling. Caring too much, investing too deeply, letting himself hope for things that might not survive the harsh light of morning, but watching that foal struggle to her feet. Watching Esperanza nuzzle her baby with the fierce tenderness of new motherhood, Jonah realized the wall was gone, and he didn't want to build it back. The foal was 3 days old and already showing signs of strength, wobbling around the stall on spindly legs, while Esperanza watched with the vigilant attention of new motherhood. Alma had named her Milagro, miracle, because that's what new life always was, especially in a place where endings seemed to outnumber beginnings. Jonah was repairing the water trough near the barn when he noticed the loose board on the tackroom wall. It had probably been loose for years, warped by temperature changes and time. But it caught his eye because it was obviously deliberate, the nails removed cleanly, the board designed to lift out. He glanced around. Alma was in the house preparing lunch. The sensible thing would be to leave it alone, respect Carlos's privacy. But something, curiosity or instinct, or the suspicion that mysteries rarely stayed buried, made Jonah slide the board free. Behind it was a metal box, the kind designed for documents, secured with a simple combination lock. The lock was hanging open, forgotten or deliberately left that way. Jonah pulled the box out and carried it to a hay bale, his heart beating harder than the discovery warranted. Inside were papers, neatly organized in folders. The first folder contained correspondence, letters between Carlos and the New Mexico Department of Agriculture, inquiries about animal sanctuary regulations. The dates went back 18 months. Jonah read through them slowly, his understanding shifting with each page. Carlos had been researching non-profit status, permit requirements, zoning regulations. He'd reached out to establish sanctuaries, asked questions about funding models and sustainable operations. The letters were methodical, thorough, written in Carlos's careful hand. The second folder contained financials, a ledger in Carlos's handwriting tracking every penny Alma had spent on the donkeys, cross-referenced with receipts and invoices. But more than that, there were notes in the margins. Could reduce feed costs by 15% with bulk purchasing cooperative. 3 local ranches interested in adopting trained geldings for livestock protection. Tourism angle, day visits, educational programs, volunteer opportunities. Carlos hadn't been angry about the donkeys. He'd been trying to save them. The third folder made Jonah's hands shake. It was a life insurance policy, separate from the one that had paid for Carlos's funeral. A small policy, taken out 2 years ago through a different company. Death benefit $50,000. Beneficiary Alma Reyes. A sticky note was attached to the policy in Carlos's handwriting for the sanctuary. Make it official. Give them a real chance. Jonah sat there in the dusty tack room, the papers spread across his lap, and felt the narrative of the past 2 years reorganize itself. The arguments between Carlos and Alma hadn't been about him wanting her to give up. They'd been about her spending money they didn't have, while Carlos was secretly planning a future where the money would exist. His anger hadn't been at her mission. It had been at his own failing body, at time running out before he could complete what he'd started. The last folder contained partial drafts of a business plan for Reyes Animal Sanctuary, a haven for forgotten equines. Carlos's prose was awkward but earnest, laying out a vision for a sustainable operation that could provide care while also educating the public about animal welfare. He'd identified potential income streams, adoption fees, volunteer programs, educational visits, training services. He'd mapped out a 3-year growth plan, identified local businesses that might sponsor specific animals, even sketched rough architectural plans for improved facilities. At the bottom of the folder was a letter addressed to Alma, unsealed but unsent. My dear Alma, if you're reading this, I'm gone and I'm sorry. Sorry for the arguments, sorry for the angry silences, sorry for making you feel alone in this fight. The truth is, I was never angry at you for loving those animals. I was angry at myself for not being younger, stronger, healthier, for not having the time to finish what I started. When you took in that first donkey, I thought you were crazy. But I watched you with Moses, saw how you refused to let him die just because the world had declared him worthless. And I understood that I'd married someone braver than I'd ever be. So I started planning, researching, trying to build something sustainable so that when I was gone, you wouldn't have to choose between the animals and survival. I wanted to surprise you with the insurance money and the business plan. Wanted to see your face when I told you we could make this real and legal and permanent. But my body had other ideas. The doctor says my heart is worn out. 67 years is long enough, he says, like that should be some comfort. I'm writing this because time is running out and I need you to know. The fighting wasn't about the donkeys. It was about knowing I wouldn't live to see them safe. That I'd leave you with half-finished dreams and problems I promised to help solve. The insurance money should be enough to get the sanctuary started properly. The business plan needs work. I'm better with horses than I am with paperwork, but the bones are there. Find someone smarter than me to help you make it official. Don't blame yourself for my death, Alma. You gave me purpose in my last years. The planning, the research, imagining a future for these forgotten creatures that made the ending easier to face. Take care of Moses for me. And Daisy and all the rest. You're doing something important, even when it doesn't feel like it. I love you. I always did, even when I was too proud or too tired to say it. Carlos Jonah read the letter 3 times, his vision blurring on the final reading. He heard footsteps and looked up to find Alma in the doorway, a question on her face that died when she saw what he was holding. "Where did you find that?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, behind a loose board in the tack room. Jonah stood slowly, his knees protesting. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have," but Alma was already moving past him to the box, her hands shaking as she picked up the insurance policy. She stared at it like it was written in a language she didn't understand, her lips moving silently as she read the numbers. $50,000, she breathed. "He never told me. We fought about money constantly, and he never—" Her voice broke. "Why wouldn't he tell me?" "He wanted to finish the plan first." Jonah handed her the letter. "He wanted to surprise you with a solution, not just money." Alma sank onto the hay bale and read the letter, tears streaming down her face unchecked. Jonah stood awkwardly, unsure whether to stay or give her privacy. But when she reached the end, she looked up at him with such raw grief that he couldn't help but move to sit beside her. "I thought he'd stopped loving me," Alma said, her voice ragged. "The silence, the anger, I thought I'd pushed him away by choosing the animals over him. But he was working on this the whole time, planning, trying to build something that would last after he was gone." She clutched the letter to her chest, rocking slightly. "I wasted our last months fighting when I should have been—" She couldn't finish the thought. "He knew you loved him," Jonah said quietly. "The letter makes that clear. He didn't blame you for anything. But I blame me." Alma's voice was fierce with self-recrimination. "I was so focused on the immediate crisis, the hungry animals at the gate, the bills coming due, that I didn't see what he was trying to do. I didn't see that he was fighting for them too, just in a different way." They sat in silence, the weight of revelation settling around them. Outside, donkeys brayed and shuffled, ignorant of the drama unfolding in the tack room. Life continuing its relentless march forward, indifferent to human grief and regret. Finally, Alma wiped her eyes and looked at the other folders. She picked up the business plan, leafed through Carlos's careful notes and sketches. "He really thought this could work. Looks like he did the research to back it up," Jonah said. "The bulk purchasing cooperative idea is solid, and the adoption program for trained geldings. Ranchers do use donkeys for livestock protection. It's not a fantasy." Alma pulled out the correspondence with the Department of Agriculture. He was already halfway through the permit process. All this paperwork I'd have needed to start from scratch. He already did it. "So the question is," Jonah said carefully, "what do you want to do now?" Alma looked at him, then at the documents spread between them. Carlos's last gift, a roadmap out of the impossible situation he'd left her in. "I want to finish what he started. I want to make this real." "It's going to take more than money," Jonah warned. "Even 50,000 won't solve everything. You'll need help, real help, consistent help. Someone to manage the business side while you handle the animals." "I know." Alma's voice was steady now, grief transforming into determination. "Carlos knew it too. That's why he left the letter. He knew I'd need someone." She turned to look at Jonah directly, and he felt the full weight of what she wasn't saying. The question hanging in the air between them, unasked but unmistakable. "Alma, I'm not asking you to give up your life. Jonah, I'm not asking you to make promises you can't keep." She gestured at the documents. "But Carlos started this, and I can't finish it alone. The insurance money will get us legal and current. But running a sanctuary day to day, making it sustainable, that takes 2 people minimum. Someone who knows animals and someone who can handle the human side of things." Jonah thought about 3 Rivers Ranch, about his bunk in the hands' quarters, about 37 years of routine and solitude. He thought about his savings account, his pocket watch, The careful walls he'd built around himself to keep from caring too much. And then he thought about Esperanza and Milagro, about Moses eating last and Daisy trusting again after nearly freezing to death. He thought about Alma's hands gentle on frightened animals, about her refusal to turn away from suffering, even when it cost her everything. "Carlos was my friend," Jonah said finally, "and he asked you to finish this. That makes it my business too." Alma's eyes filled again, but she smiled through the tears. "Are you sure? Because once we start down this path—" "I'm sure," Jonah interrupted. And he was. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was absolutely certain about something that mattered. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills. The donkeys were settling into their afternoon routine, familiar and unchanging. But inside the tack room, everything had shifted. The past had been rewritten, the future suddenly possible. "Time is the only wealth we truly spend," Jonah's father had written. And here, finally, was something worth spending it on. The insurance company took 2 weeks to process the claim. 2 weeks during which Jonah and Alma moved forward on faith and determination. Jonah drove back to Three Rivers to collect his things and have a conversation with Marcus that was harder than he'd expected. "You're quitting?" Marcus leaned back in his office chair, his weathered face showing more surprise than anger. "I'm retiring," Jonah corrected. "Been meaning to for a while now. Just found a reason to actually do it." "The Reyes woman?" "Alma, yes." Jonah met his boss's eyes directly. "She's trying to build something good, Marcus. Something that matters. And I'd like to help." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying Jonah with the intensity of someone trying to read a map in failing light. "You're 68 years old, Jonah. Starting over at your age." "I'm not starting over. I'm just starting something different. With a woman you barely know, trying to save animals nobody wants, using money that won't last 6 months if you're not careful." Marcus shook his head. "I've known you near 40 years, and I never took you for a romantic. I'm not romantic. I'm practical. And practically speaking, that woman's going to lose everything if someone doesn't help her figure this out." Jonah paused, choosing his words carefully. "Carlos was working on a plan before he died. A real plan, not just good intentions. I'm going to help finish it." Marcus sighed, a sound that carried the weight of understanding even when he didn't agree. "All right. You've earned the right to make your own choices, even if I think they're crazy. What do you need from me? A reference if anyone asks. And maybe," Jonah hesitated, feeling awkward, "maybe spread the word that we're looking for people who might want to sponsor an animal. Donations, adoption fees, that kind of thing. Once we get the legal side sorted, I'll do that," Marcus promised. He stood and extended his hand. "You're a good man, Jonah Pike, stubborn as hell but good. I hope this works out the way you're hoping." "Me too," Jonah said, shaking his hand. "Me too." He packed his belongings from the bunkhouse, a lifetime reduced to 2 duffel bags and a box of books. The young hands helped him load Cisco into the trailer he'd borrowed from Marcus, their faces showing a mix of respect and confusion at the old cowboy's sudden departure. "You really going to take care of donkeys?" one of them asked, like it was the strangest thing he'd ever heard. "Among other things," Jonah replied. "Someone's got to." The drive back to Alma's place felt different this time, not the journey of a man fulfilling an obligation, but the return of someone going home. It was a strange feeling, unsettling and comforting in equal measure. Alma was waiting when he pulled up, standing in the yard with Milagro dancing around her on increasingly steady legs. When she saw his trailer and bags, her face lit with something that made Jonah's chest tighten, in a way he'd almost forgotten was possible. "You came back," she said, like she'd half expected him to change his mind. "Said I would." They stood looking at each other for a moment. 2 people who'd stumbled into something neither had planned, but both needed. Then Alma smiled, and Jonah felt something settle inside him, a sense of rightness he hadn't known he'd been missing. The insurance money arrived 3 days later, deposited into Alma's account with a finality that felt both liberating and terrifying. $50,000, more money than she'd ever had at once. And yet, barely enough to accomplish what they needed to do. They made a list at the kitchen table. Carlos's business plan spread between them. Pay off immediate debts, feed store, vet, property taxes, file for non-profit status and sanctuary permits, repair critical infrastructure, fences, water system, shelter, purchase feed in bulk through cooperative, begin adoption sponsorship program, establish reserve fund for emergencies. The first 3 alone will take 30,000, Alma said. Pencil moving across paper. That leaves 20 for operations. And my savings, Jonah added. I've got 11,000. We pool it together. We might have enough runway to make this work. Alma looked up sharply. Jonah, no. Your retirement? I'm retired. What do I need money for? Sitting in a bank account doesn't feed donkeys. He reached across to still her hand. This is my choice, Alma. Let me make it. They hired a lawyer in town, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in agricultural law and non-profit formation. She reviewed Carlos's research with an appraising eye and nodded approvingly. He did good preliminary work, she said, tapping the folders. The permit applications are halfway complete. You'll need a board of directors, at least 3 people, and detailed operational plans. But this is doable. Expensive, but doable. How expensive? Alma asked. Legal fees will run about 4,000 to get everything filed and approved. Then there's insurance, permits, inspection fees. Figure another 3,000. You're looking at 7,000 just to become legitimate. Jonah and Alma exchanged glances. It was more than they'd hoped, but less than they'd feared. How long? Jonah asked. 3 months, maybe 4. There's bureaucracy involved, unfortunately. But once you're approved as a 501c3, you can accept tax-deductible donations. That changes everything. They left Patricia's office with a timeline and a stack of paperwork to complete. Alma was quiet on the drive back, staring out the window at the passing landscape. What are you thinking? Jonah asked. That Carlos would have loved this. The planning, the organization, making something official and real. Her voice was soft with remembered affection. He always said I was good at the heart work, and he was good at the head work. Looks like I need to learn to do both now. You've got help with the head work, Jonah reminded her. That's what I'm here for. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a new rhythm. Mornings were for animal care. Feeding, watering, health checks, the never-ending cycle of maintenance that kept 48 donkeys, counting Milagro, alive and as comfortable as circumstances allowed. Afternoons were split between repairs and paperwork, evenings for planning and exhausted dinners by lamplight. Jonah found himself learning a different kind of ranching than he'd known at 3 Rivers. This wasn't about profit or efficiency or getting cattle to market. This was about individual animals with names and histories, about the patient work of rehabilitation, about the small victories of a donkey who'd been terrified of humans finally. Accepting a gentle touch, he learned that Samson loved having his ears scratched and would lean into your hand with the contentment of a cat, that Moses was the unofficial peacekeeper among the herd, breaking up squabbles with a patient presence that needed no aggression. The Daisy followed Alma everywhere like a faithful dog, grateful beyond measure for the woman who'd saved her from freezing. And he learned about Alma herself, her fierce determination paired with surprising humor, her ability to find joy in small things, even when overwhelmed. The way she talked to the animals, like they were friends who simply spoke a different language. They worked side by side, repairing the water system, replacing pipes that had cracked over winter. Jonah was elbow-deep in a trench when Alma said, casual as commenting on the weather, "You know people are going to talk about an unmarried man living on an unmarried woman's property, about what that means." Jonah looked up at her, at the way she was carefully not looking at him. "Does it bother you? What people think?" "Used to when I was younger." Alma handed him a wrench. "Now I figure anyone who thinks taking care of dying animals is scandalous has their priorities confused." She paused. "But I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. I can make it clear that you're an employee or a business partner or—" "I'm a friend," Jonah interrupted. "Helping another friend. Anyone who can't understand that can mind their own business." Alma smiled, something easing in her shoulders. "All right then. But lying in bed that night in what had been Carlos's office, Jonah found himself thinking about the question Alma had raised. What were they to each other? Friends, certainly. Partners in this unlikely enterprise, absolutely. But there was something else threading through their interactions. A warmth, an ease, a sense of possibility that made him wonder if friendship was the whole story. He was 68 years old, too old for romantic confusion. Except apparently he wasn't, because lying there in the dark, he couldn't stop thinking about the way Alma laughed when Milagro attempted her wobbly gallop, or how her hand had felt under his that day in the kitchen, or the trust in her eyes when she'd asked him to stay and help. The county inspector came on a Tuesday, a stern-faced woman in her 40s who walked the property with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she'd seen worse, but not by much. She noted the fencing issues, the marginal shelter, the strain on the water system. But she also noted the healthy appearance of the animals, the cleanliness of the feeding areas, the obvious care being taken. "You're right on the edge of capacity for this property size," she said finally. "You get non-profit status and proper facilities. The county won't have a problem. But you can't take in any more animals until you're upgraded. Not one. You're at your limit." "Understood," Alma said, and Jonah heard the relief in her voice. Not approval exactly, but not condemnation either. They could work with this. That night, they celebrated with a simple dinner and a bottle of wine Alma found in the back of a cupboard, probably left over from some dinner party years ago. They sat on the porch as the sun set, watching the donkeys settle for the evening. "We're going to make it," Alma said, more statement than question. "We're going to try," Jonah replied. "That's all anyone can do." Alma reached over and took his hand, her fingers threading through his. The gesture was natural, inevitable, like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. Jonah squeezed back, and they sat like that in the gathering dusk. Two people who'd found each other at the end of the road and decided to build something new. Tomorrow there would be more work, more challenges, more impossible problems requiring practical solutions. But tonight, sitting on a weathered porch with his hand in hers, Jonah Pike felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. He felt hope. The smoke arrived. 3 days before the fire, Jonah noticed it first, a haze on the southern horizon that the morning sun couldn't quite penetrate. He'd seen enough range fires in his life to recognize the warning signs. The particular yellow-gray cast to the sky, the acrid smell carried on shifting winds, the nervous energy in the animals who sensed danger before humans could name it. "We need to prepare," he told Alma at breakfast, pointing toward the distant smudge. "That fire's maybe 30 miles south. If the wind shifts, we can't evacuate 48 donkeys," Alma said, her face going pale. "We don't have trailers. We don't have anywhere to take them. Even if we did, it would take days." Jonah pulled out his phone and called the county fire department. The dispatcher confirmed what he'd feared. The Sawyer Creek fire had been burning for 2 days, already consuming 8,000 acres of rangeland and scrub. Containment was at 20%. Mandatory evacuations were in effect for areas within 5 miles of the fire line. "How far are we from the fire line?" Jonah asked. "Current projections put you at 12 miles. But that could change fast with the right wind." He hung up and looked at Alma, saw his own fear reflected back. They'd spent weeks building something fragile and precious, and now the desert itself was threatening to burn it all away. "We defend the property," Jonah said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Clear brush, wet everything down, move the animals to the safest areas. If evacuation becomes mandatory, we call every rancher and neighbor within 20 miles and beg for trailer space." They spent the day in frantic preparation. Jonah hooked up every hose and sprinkler they had, soaking the ground around the buildings. Alma moved the donkeys into paddocks closest to the house and barn, away from the dry hills to the south. They raked and cleared brush, creating fire breaks where they could, their backs aching and hands blistering. By evening, the smoke was thick enough to sting their eyes. The sun set red and angry through the haze, and ash began to drift down like malevolent snow. Several donkeys were coughing, their lungs irritated by the particulates in the air. "We need to get them inside," Alma said, her voice rough from smoke. "At least the weakest ones. Moses, the pregnant Jennies, the foals." They converted the barn into temporary shelter, packing in as many animals as the space would hold. Jonah rigged wet towels over the windows to filter the air, while Alma moved through the frightened herd with practiced calm. Her voice steady and reassuring, even as her hands shook. Milagro pressed against her mother in the corner of a stall, her young eyes wide with an instinctive fear of the smoke and chaos. Alma knelt beside them, stroking Esperanza's neck, whispering promises she might not be able to keep. "It's going to be all right, sweet girl. We're going to keep you safe." Jonah watched from the barn doorway as full darkness fell. The southern horizon glowed orange now, visible even through the smoke. The fire was closer than 12 miles. Maybe 8, maybe less. The wind was picking up, gusting from the south, pushing the flames toward them. His phone rang. "Marcus! Pike! You need to evacuate!" That fire jumped the containment line. "It's moving fast. We can't move the animals, Marcus. Not all of them. Then leave them. Save yourself and Mrs. Reyes. You can't fight a wildfire. We can try." Jonah's voice was flat, final. "We've got water, we've got cleared ground. If it comes to it, you'll die," Marcus interrupted, his voice tight with anger and fear. "Don't be a fool, Jonah. Some things can't be saved." "I'm not leaving them," Jonah said. "Neither is Alma, so either help us or get off the phone." Silence. "Then what do you need?" "Trailers. As many as you can round up. Anyone willing to take donkeys temporarily until the fire passes. I'll make calls." Marcus's voice softened. "But Jonah, if the fire gets within 2 miles, you leave. You hear me? No animals are worth your life." Jonah hung up without promising anything. He looked back into the barn, where Alma was checking water buckets, her silhouette backlit by the kerosene lantern. She'd given everything for these animals, her marriage, her savings, her comfortable future. He couldn't ask her to abandon them now. And he realized, standing there with ash falling around him like snow, that he didn't want to. Carlos's letter came back to him. "You're doing something important, even when it doesn't feel like it, standing between the approaching fire and 48 animals who depended on them for survival." Jonah finally understood what Carlos had meant. This wasn't about saving donkeys. It was about refusing to accept that some lives were disposable, that suffering was inevitable, that caring too much was a weakness rather than a strength. The fire was coming. They would face it together, and whatever happened, they would not turn away. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of burning sage and distant destruction. The night was going to be long. The fire arrived at 2 in the morning, a wall of orange rage cresting the southern hills like a breaking wave. Jonah saw it from the roof of the barn, where he'd stationed himself with a hose. The flames close enough now that he could hear their roar over the wind. Below, Alma worked with desperate efficiency, moving between the paddocks with buckets of water, calming panicked animals, checking gates and latches. 3 trucks had arrived an hour earlier. Marcus and 2 neighboring ranchers with trailers, ready to evacuate as many donkeys as possible. But there wasn't time. The fire was moving too fast. "We need to start loading," Marcus shouted up to Jonah. "Now!" "The Jennies with foals first," Alma called out. Then the oldest and weakest. They worked in organized chaos, herding frightened animals into trailers, 3 or 4 at a time, while embers fell around them like malevolent fireflies. Esperanza and Milagro went first, the foal balking at the trailer ramp until Alma coaxed her up with patient words and gentle hands. Moses followed, the old Jack loading calmly, as if he trusted these humans who'd earned his faith. 12 donkeys loaded, 15, 20. But there were still nearly 30 left, and the fire was maybe a mile away now, close enough that Jonah could feel its heat against his face even at this distance. "That's all we can take," one of the ranchers said, securing his trailer gate. "We'll come back for more if there's time." The trucks pulled out, red taillights disappearing into the smoke-choked darkness. Jonah climbed down from the roof and found Alma standing in the middle of the yard, surrounded by the remaining animals. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, her shoulders squared against the impossible. "We're not leaving them," she said before he could speak. "I know." Jonah moved to her side, and together they looked south toward the approaching flames. "We wet everything down one more time. Create the biggest firebreak we can. Hope the wind shifts or the fire loses strength before it reaches us." They worked side by side in the terrible orange glow, soaking the ground, the buildings, the animals themselves. The donkeys stood in confused clusters, coughing from smoke, their eyes showing white with fear. Daisy pressed against Alma's legs, refusing to leave her side, even when Alma tried to move her to safer ground. "Stubborn girl," Alma murmured, scratching between the Jenny's ears. "Just like me." The fire reached the base of the near hill, and for a moment Jonah thought it would sweep over them like a tide, unstoppable and final. But then the wind shifted, just slightly, just enough, pushing the main fire line to the east. "It's going around us," Jonah breathed, hardly daring to believe it, but trailing behind the main fire. Spot fires ignited from airborne embers, small blazes that sprang up in the dry grass and brush. One caught in the scrub 30 yards from the fence line. Another flared near the old chicken coop they'd been meaning to tear down. Jonah grabbed shovels, and they attacked the spot fires with everything they had. Dirt, water, desperate determination. His lungs burned from smoke, his body screaming exhaustion. But he kept moving, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant death for the animals depending on them. Alma fought beside him, her movements mechanical with fatigue but relentless. When an ember landed on her sleeve and began to smolder, she beat it out without breaking stride, without stopping her work. The propane tank near the house became their worst nightmare, a spot fire spreading toward it with terrible purpose. If that tank exploded, everything within 50 yards would be destroyed. Jonah ran for it with the hose, spraying water in a desperate arc, while Alma threw dirt on the advancing flames. For 15 minutes they fought that single fire, minutes that felt like hours. Their world narrowed to this one patch of burning ground and the lethal tank it threatened to consume. And then, finally, miraculously, the flames died. Not from their efforts alone, but from the same shifting wind that had pushed the main fire away. Creating a momentary lull in its advance, Jonah collapsed against the side of the house, his chest heaving, his hands blistered and raw. Alma sank down beside him, her head dropping to his shoulder in exhaustion too profound for words. Around them, the remaining donkeys stood in the smoke-filled yard, coughing but alive. The barn still stood. The house was intact. Small fires still burned in the distance, but the immediate threat had passed. "We did it," Alma whispered, her voice raw and broken. "We actually did it." Jonah wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They sat like that in the orange-lit darkness. Two people who'd chosen to fight against impossible odds and somehow, improbably, survived. The night wasn't over. There would be hours yet of watching, of fighting flare-ups, of waiting for the all-clear. But the worst had passed. They had held the line. In the distance, sirens announced the arrival of the volunteer fire department, too late to help, but welcome nonetheless. Help was coming. The trailers would return for the remaining animals. Morning would bring exhaustion and assessment and the long work of recovery, but they had survived. Together they had saved what mattered most, and that, Jonah thought as he held Alma close while ash fell around them like strange snow, that was everything. 6 months later, on a cool November morning, Jonah stood at the newly repaired fence line and watched the sunrise paint the hills in shades of gold and rose. The land bore scars from the fire, patches of blackened earth, vegetation still struggling to recover, but life had a way of returning if you gave it time and care. Behind him, the property had transformed. The insurance money from the fire damage, combined with Carlos's life insurance and a flood of donations that had poured in after the local news covered their story, had funded real improvements. New fencing, a proper shelter with separate stalls, an upgraded water system that could handle the herd's needs. The county had approved their non-profit status 3 weeks ago, and the sign at the entrance now read, Reyes Pike Animal Sanctuary, a haven for forgotten equines. Alma had insisted on the Pike addition, overruling his objections. "Carlos started this and you helped finish it," she'd said. "Both names belong here." The sound of hooves made him turn. Alma was walking up from the barn with Daisy at her side and Milagro dancing around them both. The young Jenny, now 5 months old and full of the kind of fearless energy that came from never knowing hunger or cruelty. Moses followed at his own pace, the old Jack moving slower these days, but still serving as the herd's steady anchor. "Morning," Alma said, coming to stand beside him. She handed him a mug of coffee, steam rising in the cool air. "Thought you might need this. You know me too well. I'm learning." She smiled, and Jonah marveled at how that smile had become the best part of his days. Easy and warm, carrying none of the desperate exhaustion that had marked her face when they first met. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sanctuary come to life. 43 donkeys now, after successful adoptions of 5 geldings to ranches that wanted livestock protection. 3 more were in training, working with Alma on the behavioral issues that had made them unadoptable before. "The volunteer group is coming this afternoon," Alma said. 8 people signed up for the weekend shift. We might actually get the new paddock finished. The volunteer program had been Jonah's idea, adapted from notes in Carlos's business plan. People came for a day or a weekend, helping with projects in exchange for the satisfaction of contributing to something meaningful. Some came once, others returned regularly, forming the kind of community neither Jonah nor Alma had expected, but both desperately needed. "I got an email from Patricia this morning," Alma continued. "That grant application we submitted, we're finalists. 50,000 if we win it. That's 2 years of feed, maybe more if we're careful. That's good news." "It is." Alma turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "This house has 3 bedrooms. You've been sleeping in Carlos's old office for 6 months. Doesn't seem right, you being cramped in there when there's a whole bedroom upstairs sitting empty." Jonah felt his heart rate pick up, understanding the question she wasn't quite asking. They'd grown close over the months, the kind of closeness that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. But they'd been careful not to push beyond friendship, both carrying enough history to be wary of rushing into something that might complicate what they'd built. "Alma, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," she said quickly. "I just mean, you're not a guest here anymore, Jonah. You're not temporary help. This is your home too, if you want it to be. Officially, permanently." Jonah pulled the silver pocket watch from his vest, a habit so ingrained he barely noticed doing it anymore. He clicked it open, checked the time, studied the inscription his father had written so many years ago. "Time is the only wealth we truly spend." He'd spent 68 years being careful with that wealth, hoarding it, protecting it, spending it only on things that felt safe and certain. And what had it gotten him? A solitary life in a bunkhouse, no family to speak of, no legacy beyond fence lines and cattle drives that would be forgotten before his body was cold. Then he'd ridden to deliver an envelope of wages and found Alma surrounded by forgotten animals, pouring out her wealth of time without counting the cost. And in helping her, in choosing to spend his time on something that mattered beyond himself, Jonah had found what he'd been missing all along. "Yes," he said simply. "I want that." Alma's smile was radiant. "Good, because I can't imagine doing this without you anymore." They walked back toward the house together, Daisy and Milagro trailing behind like a small processional. In the paddocks, donkeys brayed their morning greetings, Samson with his crooked shoulder, the 3 rescued Jennies who'd arrived last month, the young Jack who'd finally learned that hands could be gentle, each one a life saved, each one proof that one person, or 2 people together, could push back against cruelty and indifference, even if just in this small corner of the world. That evening, after the volunteers had gone, and the animals were settled for the night, Jonah and Alma sat on the porch as the stars emerged. A light breeze carried the smell of sage and desert flowers, the land recovering its beauty after the fire's devastation. "Do you ever regret it?" Alma asked quietly. "Leaving 3 Rivers, using your savings, tying yourself to this impossible project?" Jonah thought about his old life, The predictable routine, the comfortable solitude, the careful walls he'd maintained around his heart. Then he thought about Milagro taking her first wobbling steps, about Moses eating his grain in peaceful old age, about standing beside Alma as they fought the fire and chose not to run. Not for a second, he said, and meant it. Alma reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Carlos would have liked you, she said, would have appreciated the way you see these animals, not as problems to solve, but as lives worth protecting. He was a good man. I'm trying to honor what he started. You're doing more than that. You're making it real. They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, two people who'd found each other at the end of one journey and the beginning of another. The sanctuary would always be a struggle. There would never be enough money, never enough time, always more animals needing help than they could possibly save. But that was all right, because the point wasn't to save them all. The point was to save the ones they could, and to do it with the kind of fierce, stubborn love that refused to accept that some lives didn't matter. Jonah felt the pocket watch press against his chest, its familiar weight, a reminder of his father's wisdom and his own journey to understanding it. Time was wealth, yes, but the true measure of that wealth wasn't in the keeping. It was in how you chose to spend it. And here, in this place, with this woman and these forgotten animals, Jonah had finally learned to spend it well. The riding days were over, but the living, the real living, had only just begun.